Well, we are ready to begin chapter 8, which takes us to another phase of Jesus' Great Commission challenge, mandate to his disciples in Acts 1:8. Remember that after Jerusalem and Judea comes Samaria, and that's where the gospel is about to go. Fascinating story of what God does in the city of Samaria. I'm going to give you a bit of an outline here to show you kind of how things progress in this chapter and just beyond that. You have Philip and Samaria and Gaza, and then you come to the conversion of Saul of Tarsus, whom we better know as the Apostle Paul. That's chapter 9. And then in chapter 10, actually 9 and 10, you have Peter in Judea and moving on to Caesarea. And then in chapter 11, the founding of the church in Antioch. So this kind of gives us a bird's eye view of the ministry as it moves out of Judea into Samaria and even up as far as Antioch. And again, please remember that that doesn't mean that we're going to forget about Jerusalem or that Jerusalem, starts to dwindle as a church. No, that's not the point at all. Jerusalem continues to thrive as a church, but the gospel expands and takes in other regions as well. So this kind of gives you a bird's eye view of how that looks. And then in chapter 12, you can see that James and Peter will be persecuted. James, in God's providence, will actually be promoted to glory, and Peter will be released and allowed to continue his ministry here. So that actually, all of that together actually brings us to the very end of the second section of the Great Commission. And so once you get to chapter 13, you're moving into the unto the ends of the earth part of the commission. And that's where the church in Antioch will call Barnabas and Saul to take the gospel to other regions beyond. And of course, eventually the book of Acts will take us all the way to Rome. All right. So now we met Saul, and he was involved at least in the stoning of Stephen. Apparently, he kept the garments of those who were stoning him, and that is usually understood to refer to the fact that he kind of guarded their clothing so that they would be free of impediments when they're trying to stone Stephen. But nonetheless, he is in support of it, and Luke makes that clear right here in verse 1. Saul was consenting to his death. And some would say that the word in the Greek there for consenting is a word that was used in a voting context, which may signify that Paul was actually involved in making the decision to stone Stephen. And people will use that argument to say that means that Saul was actually a member of the Sanhedrin. But that really is taking it beyond what the word insists that we understand. In fact, we'll often use words like vote just to say that we're in favor of something. For instance, I may say to you, yeah, I'll vote for that one. Well, we're not really voting. We're just using a saying that says, I support that. Or, yeah, I'll cast my lot in with these guys, or something of that nature. So what we do know for sure is that Saul was in favor of the death of Stephen. And when that happened, a great persecution arose against the church at Jerusalem. Now remember that up until now, the persecution has been limited to the apostles. The church at large, the common people in the church, have not been directly impacted by the persecution. But that changes here in chapter 8. Once Stephen is persecuted, it just appears that the Sanhedrin lights a fire in the city, and a general persecution against the entire church ensues as a result of that. All right. So this is a big deal. And one of the questions that some have asked is, where was Gamaliel in all this? If the Sanhedrin is in favor of Stephen's stoning now, where's the influence of Gamaliel, who was able to talk them out of persecuting or killing the apostles? And that's a really good question. As far as we know, Gamaliel probably died around the year 50, and we're still in the early 30s here, and maybe as far as 35 AD, but probably not. Anyway, Gamaliel's still alive, And so, what happened? And the best answer I can give you is that the anger of the Sanhedrin has reached a boiling point now, to the place that even a man like Gamaliel is no longer able to contain the fury and hatred that they show towards Stephen and the church. And so this general persecution takes place. And notice that they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria except the apostles. All right, now scattering here is a word that actually means diaspora. It's a word that's used of Israel being scattered among the nations. Um, but the interesting thing here is that everybody is scattered except the apostles. And the question here arises, what about the apostles? I mean, if they were the leaders, if they were the ones that were really, uh, leading this new movement, then why did they stay? I mean, did they hide someplace in Jerusalem? Did the Sanhedrin simply think that because everybody else had scattered, there was enough fear and confusion among the church, so just leave the apostles alone? It's really difficult to say for sure. Some people have suggested that the persecution was really leveled against the Hellenistic Jews. Stephen was a Hellenist. Those 7 leaders who were chosen all had Hellenistic names. And some would suggest that maybe just that element of the church was persecuted. But that really doesn't seem to be what Luke is telling us here. I don't see any reason for us to conclude that only half of the church is being persecuted. The Sanhedrin hates all of the church, and Stephen represented all the church and not just the Hellenistic side. It's possible that the apostles simply decided that they were going to go back to Jerusalem and suffer whatever consequences may come. If they were apprehended or killed, then they would just accept that as God's will. But whatever the case, there is a church-wide persecution now taking place. So what happens? Devout men carried Stephen to his burial. Of course, these would have been members of the church in Jerusalem, and they made great lamentation over him. And that just points up the great respect and admiration that people showed towards Stephen. Even though we don't hear a lot about him, the account about him in Acts is very brief. We do understand that here was a man who was greatly used of God to make an influence. And I'll repeat this again, but let me just say that I really believe that Stephen's testimony is going to follow Paul and haunt him and play a big role in Paul actually coming to the Lord Jesus Christ. Well, what about Paul? Well, he's still called Saul here. He won't be called Paul until we get to Acts chapter 13. I'll just make a statement about that. It's not that his name was changed from Saul to Paul, but because most of the people at this time and in this location were bilingual, they spoke at least 2 languages, in some case more. Many of them used more than one language or more than one name, depending on where they were and with whom they were interacting. And so when we find him referred to as Paul in Acts 13 and beyond, it's not a name change. It's just a name that really accompanies the ministry among the Gentiles that he's going to be leading. But here he's in a Jewish context, and so we're going to maintain the name Saul. He made havoc of the church. I mean, he went crazy. He pulled out all the stops. He was on steroids, if you will, when it came to persecuting the church. Notice, dragging off, and not just men, but normally the women would not play a political role and get involved in this sort of thing. But in this case, even women were being apprehended. And this just shows you the absolute fury of the Apostle Paul. And again, I suspect that part of the reason for this exaggerated conduct is because he is fighting against the testimony of Stephen that just persecutes his mind and his heart. And in order to be free from that and overcome that, he just goes bananas in executing the wrath of the Jewish people, Jewish leaders against the church. So it's just extreme persecution going on. And what happens? And notice the way that Luke says this. Therefore, almost as if this is something that the reader would expect. But would we really expect this? Therefore, because of this intense, overbearing execution, those who were scattered went everywhere preaching the word. And that's the word used for evangelizing, sharing the gospel message. I mean, that's just absolutely amazing. It doesn't say that those who were scattered went everywhere worrying about what would happen to them, wondering about their jobs, thinking about their families back home, questioning God's goodness, wondering if the church would survive. Nothing like that at all. This really points up a maturity in the church, and this church is very young. Again, the church is probably only a few years old at this point, and yet it's manifesting a measure of maturity that really calls attention. Now, we're going to switch to Philip. And here's a new guy in the book of Acts. He was mentioned as one of the 7 who was chosen, but now we're going to get a little bit of narrative about his life. In this persecution, where does Philip go? He goes to the city of Samaria, and he preached Christ to them. Now, Samaria is a region north of the Galilee, but there was also a city called Samaria in there, just kind of like you have New York, New York. It's a city and it's a state. And this is where Philip goes. Now, why he goes there, we're not told. We don't have any background. One thing we do notice, as I've stated here, is that nothing is ever said about Stephen and Philip administering the daily distribution. I mentioned that a few recordings ago, but it is interesting that you don't hear anything more about that daily distribution of goods. And I suspect that that's because once the persecution began and people were scattered out of Jerusalem, that particular ministry could no longer function. The concept of helping others and being generous and sharing, that would go on for 2,000 years. That should be a hallmark of the church at any point. But the formal distribution and sharing of goods as it was conducted in that situation had apparently ceased. All right, so there is the region of Samaria. Notice that below it is Judea and above it is Galilee. I may have misspoken a moment ago and said that it's north of Galilee. If I did, I apologize. It actually is situated between Judea and Galilee. And you may remember that when people would pass through from Judea up north to Galilee, they would actually go around Samaria so as to avoid stepping on Samaritan land and thus defiling themselves. I mean, there was a very real hatred, a shared hatred here between the Jews and the Samaritans. All right. Now, notice the response of the people here. Multitudes, not just a few. This isn't just a passing thing, but multitudes with one accord, all together, heeded the things spoken by Philip, hearing and seeing the miracles which he did. Now remember that other than the apostles, only Stephen and Philip are said to have performed miracles in the book of Acts, and you see that here. Now, and notice why so many? What's the explanation for this incredible response to the gospel? I mean, look at verse 7. Unclean spirits crying with a loud voice came out of many who were possessed, and many who were paralyzed and lame were healed. This is incredible. And I would say that probably to understand more fully what's going on here, we need to go all the way back to the ministry of the Lord Jesus Christ in John chapter 4. He met with the woman at the well, and you remember that story. She ends up going back into town and telling everybody about who she has met. They come pouring out of the city of Sychar to meet up with Jesus there and to find out who this guy is. And I really believe that what Jesus did there in John 4 kind of planted a seed. It laid the groundwork for an incredible harvest that Philip would reap here during his visit to Samaria. And it's just a good reminder to us that when God blesses our ministries, it's usually a result of something that someone else has done prior to us, and God has given us the privilege of being the recipients of that harvest. More about Samaria and Philip's ministry when we come back next time.